and welcome to the third episode of the Scratch Art Animal series. Today we are going to be completing the Scratch Art Animal drawing that we began together last episode. So we were working really hard on laying out all of these lines so that it was mostly just filling in the values rather than actually trying to draw out a cat realistically. So now our job is to go through and pay attention to the length of the lines and the amount of value changes so that we can match it with our texture on this scratch board to create our cat drawing. So that's what we're working on today, and I'll show you the steps now. We are picking up right where we left off from the last episode, so if you haven't seen the steps to get this far, I would recommend going back and watching episode 2 before you begin. To continue working on the fur in this area, we're adding some very short little strokes that are fairly spaced out to just fill in the rest of this tuft above that eyebrow. Next, I surrounded this area that I wanted to stay a nice medium tone so that I didn't accidentally fill it in all the way before I began. So I outlined it with a lighter tone, and then I went through that space and just added a couple individual lines, made sure that I was pressing really lightly, and tried to fill it in so that it had a smooth transition. Then I started to do that same step in that area up above on the forehead of the cat, and I was working really hard to add in the spots that I knew were going to be white first, and sort of using this opportunity to go through and outline any of those spaces to make sure that I didn't accidentally fill them in. So that's the best tip I can give for the forehead, is to just go through and do your best to add white where you know it's going to be white and outline any areas that you want to stay black while using sort of a textured outline. You don't want to have like a solid outline with your scratch marks. Even as a fairly experienced artist myself, I still got kind of lost when I was working on the forehead. So I actually started to use my finger to show me where I was at quite often so that I wouldn't forget what I was looking at and what I was trying to make it look like. So the biggest tip I can give to you is to try your hardest to pay attention to the reference photo, because if you try to draw this just guessing what it's going to look like, it's not going to look like the picture. That's for sure. I was using that crisscross value technique as I was creating these textures on the forehead, and my main goal was to add the outlines of the spaces that I wanted to keep dark. So that was my main focus, was filling in that lighter value where I knew it was going where it was supposed to be, and going back through and outlining all of those spaces that are going to be dark. I continued working on the forehead, and I'd say out of all of the details you're going to add, the forehead is probably the trickiest, just because it requires so much attention to detail to make it look like the reference photo. So I actually switched and gave myself a little bit of a break and started working on the eyebrow on the right-hand side, just to break up that difficult area a little bit so I wasn't feeling the stress of working on something that requires so much attention. So I switched to working on the eyebrow, and I noticed that it is very white in a nice tall column, so I made sure to go through and fill that in and to incorporate any of those longer lines that I saw. As you work your way towards the right side of that eye, you'll notice that the lines that you're adding for that eyebrow are actually going to start switching direction and become a little bit more horizontal, still diagonal, but more horizontal. So you're going to go through and work on adding those while also paying attention to any patches of white that you see and going through and adding those to make sure that you've got enough contrast in your drawing. Next, I started working on adding the start of that bright highlight of fur just beneath the ear, and so I noticed that the length of the lines really changed drastically, so as it gets closer to the right-hand side, those length of lines really do increase. I was also working on adding those curved hairs that were coming out of the ear, and I really was trying to thicken up those lines because the line I created with just one pass of my scratching tool was really too thin, so I had to go back over it multiple times. From here, I started working on that right hand eye, and so I was filling in the highlight and going through and finding any of those solid areas of white that I could add. Remember that at this point of the drawing, we are still just focused on filling in those brightest white areas. So instead of going back through and filling in a lot of the medium tones that I'll definitely need to fill in later, I'm really focused on just going through and making sure that I've got some solid white areas where I see them in my photo. So I continued on by adding the white value that goes underneath that right eye, and I noticed that the direction of that fur is very horizontal, and so those lines should be pretty much just going straight out from the eye. And as you continue working, you'll get to that edge, and I think it's best to just sort of stop there, and then we can go back over it and add that medium tone afterwards. I was just looking for those bright white areas to add, and I saw that the next large white space to work on is the right side of this cheek. And so I began by giving myself a border so that I didn't accidentally go into the dark area while I was filling this space in. And I made that border with really short, tiny little lines so that I didn't accidentally imply that there were really long hairs or really long fur on those cheeks, because we know that it's fairly short. So I was paying really close attention to the length of the lines I was working with. As I was filling in the cheeks, I realized that I wasn't quite sure where the whiskers were going to attach, and so I flipped my picture back over to re-outline all of those areas to make sure that I didn't accidentally fill them in. Next, I worked on adding one of those horizontal rows in between the sections where the whiskers attach to the cat's face. So I was working on brightening up that row and just paying attention to my reference photo to help me fill it in. I used the side of my scratching tool pretty often because I had to go back in and make sure that that white was bright enough so that as I continued my drawing, I would have enough contrast between my medium tones, the black from the paper, and that white. Again, my goal was just to continue working on adding that bright white first, so instead of continuing the rest of those cheeks, I decided to add in the whiskers because I saw that the majority of the cheek on the right is actually a lot of medium tone, so we'll fill that in later. So I just went through and was working on filling in those individual whiskers using the side of my scratching tool. Adding the whiskers was really the last step of what you needed to complete to fill in all of those pure white spaces. So now we can start adding in more of that medium tone, which means that we're going to be thinking about how we're spacing out our lines and that texture to make sure that it's not just filled in solid white. To fill in the bottom part of that right cheek, I was really focused on using very short, tiny little lines that were curving around the shape of that mouth. And I was really focused on looking at the reference photo to make sure that I was matching it in value and with the line direction. Next, we're going to start adding the texture and value for the little chin right at the bottom. And you'll notice that in the picture, the chin is actually fairly blurred, so it's really difficult to tell what direction those lines are going in. So I just sort of fudged it and filled in that space in the areas that I knew it needed to be filled in, and just kind of made up the direction of the lines on my own, and my goal was to make it look like it was curving around that space, so it's sort of straight up and down in the center and then curved towards the middle on either side for that chin. And as you're finishing this section up, it's important to make sure that you have at least a few little marks that are leading back towards the cheeks and almost coming in contact with them, and that's just because that's the shape we see in the reference photo, so we want to mimic it the best that we can. Now that we're working on adding our medium values too, we're able to go back through and start some of those medium tones that we just left alone as we were adding just the solid white. So we're going to go back up against the edge of that eye and start working in some of those short little marks for the fur. We're going to continue adding those short little lines all the way up against the tear duct space of this eye. And what we're doing right now is really defining the shape of that black line that goes around the eye. So we're trying to make it a nice even line. We want to make sure that we don't have too much black space for that area, so we're going all the way up against that edge. And if you've lost that edge, if you don't have it drawn anymore with your pencil, you can always flip your paper back over and transfer it back on from your photo. From here, I started adding the medium tone that goes in the iris of that left eye, and I was doing it with a very small scribble technique. So rather than creating larger circles as I was drawing, I used very, very tight condensed circles to fill in this medium tone. Now, I didn't want to fill it all the way in, so I made sure that the section that was in the middle of those circles that I was drawing still had a little bit of white showing through. So it's really about finding a good balance and making sure that the white around your iris stands out and that the black of your pupil stands out. So you're trying to make it just right in the middle. I continued adding that medium tone all the way throughout that cheek area off to the left as well. So I was really working on creating an outline for myself first so that I didn't accidentally fill in a spot that I wasn't supposed to. So this is an area that I planned to leave darker, and I outlined it to make sure that I didn't accidentally fill it in. As I was working on adding this medium tone, I used just a very fast tapping method with the end of my scratch tool to create a bunch of tiny little dots. And that's something that I used to fill in quite a few of my medium tone or almost black areas. And I just used really fast repeating motions to make it go a little bit quicker, and I didn't lift my scratch tool very high up off the paper because that lifting motion takes a lot of time. So I made it go by a lot faster by just tapping repeatedly in multiple areas. From here, I created a sort of a border on that side, the left side of the nose, just to show myself how far out I was going to go with the value on my cheeks. At this point, it's really important that we continue to pay attention to our reference photo. So we really need to be looking at that image to figure out where our brightest values and our darkest values will go. We also are looking at the length of the lines to help us figure out how long to draw our lines to represent this cat's fur. So at this point, I'm just going through and adding some really short, slightly horizontal looking lines to fill in the cheeks. Then I added some stippling value just right up above the top of the left side of the cheek to help it fade out into that tone. And I added that same stipple technique coming down off of that left eyebrow. So I just used my scratching tool to tap repeatedly on that paper, sort of at an angle rather than straight up and down with that point. And so it's able to add a bunch of tiny little dots to help that value transition smoother. From here, I added a brighter section in the forehead after looking at my reference photo. I realized I could go a bit lighter and fill in that space that's towards the left side eyebrow and sort of extending out towards the center of the face. So I was working with really short lines and looking back and forth from my reference photo multiple times throughout this process. Don't forget to add this tiny little swoop that kind of goes around the outside of the nostril, and then I continued working on the nose from there. So I was just adding a bunch of tiny little dots, and notice that there is a section of dark right up against the nose, so we want to make sure that we're not going too far into that, but we want to have a nice transition into the dark. So I used a lot of the stipple technique, and I just worked with really tiny dots and tapping that paper to try to get it to transition smoothly. I kind of skip around a lot in this drawing, but the next thing that I did was to add those tiny little whiskers up at the top. And I know that the one I just drew in the picture was black, but I chose to turn it white because I'm the artist and I get to make that choice. Haha. So from there, I continued adding the whisker that's by the eyebrow on the right-hand side and just went through and cleaned it up a bit. From there, I started working on the right side eyebrow and was just filling in that first patch of value, and I was relying really heavily on those lines that I had transferred from the original cat drawing. And so if I ever had a line that I needed that I couldn't see, I just flipped that picture back over and redrew it with my pencil to help myself out. So at this point, I was just really paying attention to the direction of the lines, and I noticed that although that eyebrow is sort of slanted at an angle, leaning back towards the eye, the hairs are actually going pretty straight up and down. So that was something that I tried to incorporate as I was drawing this eyebrow, which is really kind of difficult because my first impulse was to make the eyebrow hairs going in the same direction as the slant of the eye, but that's not actually what we see. So it's really important to make sure that we're looking very closely at our reference photo to find all of the details to add to make it look more like the reference photo. Then I added the frame that goes on the right side of the nose to make sure that I wasn't filling in any spaces that I had planned on being black. So I gave myself that little border, and then I was using really short, tiny little horizontal lines to fill in some of the nose and cheek and that area just going across the face. This next step is quite possibly going to drive you crazy because there are 1,000 dots that you have to make to fill in this texture. But I guarantee you it's going to be worth it in the end because it's going to look so much more realistic if you take the time to just add tiny little dots in this space rather than like any other shapes like the little Nike swoosh you get when you're going too fast or those big circles that people tried to fill in when they were learning the stipple technique. So I would definitely recommend taking your time and just adding enough little tap marks to fill this space in with the correct value. At this point, I realized that I wasn't quite sure how far out to bring those dots to, and I didn't want to accidentally bring it out too far. So I created a border, and I was really thinking about not adding a solid line as I went. I was making sort of like a randomly patchy spotted border rather than drawing in a solid line of any type. So I was just doing that so that I wouldn't go into that space that's supposed to be black on accident. It's really important to make sure that you don't fill in that section right up against the bottom right side of the nose because that has a darker medium tone to it and a little bit of a highlight off to the side where that little swoosh is that goes over the nostril. So make sure that you block that space out. Next, I was working on adding these lines that are almost vertical near the center of the cat's head. So I'm doing this to lead up to that darker stripe that kind of comes right down that cat's face. And so I'm making sure that these lines are a little bit longer and that you can really see the direction they're going in to help imply the fur there. And this is what it looked like as I started to fill in the bridge of the nose. So you can really see here how tiny those dots need to be to make this work out well and make that nose look like it's got that velvety texture of fur going over the top. Next, I continued working on filling in that forehead, so I paid attention to my reference photo, looked back and forth continuously, and used the information of how long the lines were and what direction they were going in to help me make this picture look more realistic. Next, I started working on closing the gap between these two lighter areas and just really defining that darker space that goes right down the center of the cat's head. So I was working with very specific lines going at one angle, so they were sort of slanted towards the center, and I just made sure not to add too many so that it wouldn't get too bright. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this episode of the Scratch Art Animal series. I hope that it was helpful and that you feel really proud of the cat that you created because you are a pretty cool cat yourself. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you for the next episode.